Hi everyone. We're just waiting for everybody to connect. All right. So I guess we'll start. Well, welcome back for everybody that was parted way with us 30 minutes ago, and welcome to everybody else to this fifth masterclass of our Games Made in Europe program. Welcoming today Simon Carless on who's going to talk about game hook and discoverability. For every one of you that hasn't been in one of those masterclasses, what we do for Q&A is that we have a small discussion with them at the end. If you have a question during the presentation, you can use the Q&A feature of Zoom at the bottom of your screen. Write down your question, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll go through all of them and try to answer them as best as as Simon can. That being said, I guess we are all set. So, Simon, floor is yours.
Cool. That's great. Hey everyone, thanks for coming to this talk. As you can see, it's called Perfecting Your Game Hook and the 10 Commandments of Discoverability. And I do have an extra section at the end, which will get a little bit wider. So there might be some questions you have from that. But yeah, who am I? So I was a game developer a while ago. I've been in the industry for about just over 25 years now. You know, more recently, I was involved in the Independent Games Festival and Game Developers Conference for about 15 years. And I was the original investor, and I'm still advising No More Robots, which is you know, a British publisher led by Mike Rose, who's done some interesting stuff, some pretty successful stuff like Descenders. And so in 2020, I founded GameDiscoverCo, which is really about how do people find out about your game. So that's sort of what I'm doing nowadays. Here's a good sort of starting point for a quote. I like this quote from Chris Charler from Xbox. He says, discoverability may actually be a harder thing to solve for than investment. And what he's really talking about there is, you know, you can't buy discoverability with money. You can pay for ads, sure, but the central concept of people finding out about your game, you have to engineer ways for people to do that, and it's not necessarily just pay some people, because a return on investment on PC and console games is notoriously difficult to track, and I think that many people do not get positive return on investment when doing paid ads for PC and console, partly because of that. So the first part of this talk is about the concept of hook and why it's important to think about. And this is obviously because of the amount of games hitting the market. So when I say hook, I think, you know, I'm talking about, do people really notice your game? Why do people notice your game? This is quite a abstract concept, but it's quite important. And I think an incorrect way of thinking about hook is, I'll make the game I'm personally invested in, and then I'll get a publisher to worry about that, or someone to do PR and marketing. They can worry about that. I think, you know, even if you have a publisher, and even if you have some PR and marketing folks helping you out, devs really need to focus on how to stand out right from very early on, from before you think of the central idea of the game that you're going to work on, all the way up to launch. So I recommend always think like you're the person solely responsible for people finding out about your game, even if you're not. Otherwise, you may accidentally delegate that task in your brain to somebody and not think about it enough, and then you will not be well set up for success. Another quote I really like here from Ryan Clark from Brace Yourself Games, who did Crypt of the Necrodancer, you might know. And he's on some really good articles and videos about the hook concept. He has a couple, I think, on the Brace Yourself YouTube channel. But I really like this quote. In music, a hook is a short riffle melody or phrase that really grabs the listener and gets stuck in their head. In games, a hook is similar, but often takes effect before the game is even played. I think this is another part of hook that sometimes people have trouble with, because they're kind of like, well, people will play my game and not love it. And the answer, you can think this is depressing or not, is many people, most people, make buying decisions about games before they've played them. You may have a demo, You may be showing in festivals, but 95% of your audience will buy the game without having played it, just because of the nature of everything. So that means that your hook is really important, because that's going to be a really big reason why people buy a game. And it's not to do with how the game plays. I'm presuming you can make a game that plays well. So when we talk about this concept of hook, what can we start with? And I think the overall thing is, how do viewers feel, not players, how do viewers feel after 5 to 10 seconds? And how can you maximize that appeal? And don't forget, yeah, it's not about how it plays, it's about how it communicates. And people need to ideally understand it pretty quickly. It can't be kind of like, oh, if you watch this trailer for 2 minutes, you understand it. A lot of people are browsing through a lot of games nowadays. They really need to understand it quite quickly. So in terms of visual ways to stand out, I think perceived depth is an important one nowadays, because there's a lot of games out there, and if you're talking about a game that's not in a subscription service, people want to know that they can spend $20 on it, or 20 euros, and get there and get their money's worth. And so, does it look like I can play it for a long time? Does it look complex? Does it look rewarding? Those are value judgments that exist, at a very high level. But I think you need to think about those, because people do want to think that the game is deep. Obviously, standout art direction goes without saying. If it does have amazing pixel art or graphical effects, then people will be more excited to play it. That's reasonable and conventional. If the game feels visceral or juicy, I had a recent newsletter where Derek Liu, who makes trailers, was talking about this kind of the juicy or the game feel concept. Does the game feel look nice? Has it got good FX and bending, warping effects and all that type of stuff? And there is a presentation, I think by Petri Perho, on YouTube called Juice It or Lose It, which I recommend people watching. And that sort of talks about juice quite a lot. And I think that's a good concept to think about. And then just throwing another one out there, like, actually, I don't know about this, because I think plenty of games, plenty of grimdark fantasy games do very well, but sometimes alternative settings can help. I do think about, for example, gangsters. Like, I actually think, a kind of a prohibition set game in the 1920s with gangsters, there's not a ton of those that actually stands out. Maybe people like that setting. So that's another visual way to maybe stand out. So while most people just look at your game and decide whether they like it, it's also a great thought experiment to talk about how can you describe the game so it's exciting in a short sentence or paragraph. And I think one good example is from my friends at No More Robots. Their game Not Tonight is described as a post-Brexit dystopian bouncer simulator. I'm not saying everyone will be like, oh, I'm signing up to play that, but I think it's interesting. And I think if you can get something interesting in there, then that's kind of important. Then what makes for a great game hook in terms of text elements that matter? I think genre mashups are very good. X genre meets Y genre can be a strong angle for a text description. People really like twists on existing genres. There's an argument it should be a 80% one genre with a 20% twist of another genre, but that's really up to you. Having procedural elements or large-scale systems in the game also really help hook folks. It's talking about either there's large systems, so it's replayable, or it's procedural, so it's different every time. I think we know that a lot of procedural games are popular because of that, the roguelites, etc. You can also emphasize the range of modes. If your game is not like that, then emphasizing the range of modes, I think, is good. Like, people always worry, I think, when buying games, that they'll be done after 30 minutes and it'll be a waste of their money. And so I think finding ways to say, oh, we don't just have a central mode. It doesn't have to be big modes. We have a free player, a free roam mode, or we have a little daily challenge or something. I think that stuff really helps. Also, gameplay centric language. I think this is definitely a mistake that you can make, where you're very much caught up in your game. So you talk maybe about the story, and maybe your whole capsule description on Steam is about the story. But what I'd say is, stories are great, but they're not a good discovery lens before release. People won't be like, oh, this person says this game has a great story, I'm going to pick it up. Like that's fine for word of mouth after you launch, but I definitely do think you want to be very clear about what you do in the game, not the story of the game. And I think if what you do in the game sounds exciting, then people will be more excited about it. Then you really want to perfect your hook. And I'm saying this is pretty early on. This isn't like with 2 months to launch. This is like when you're thinking of the idea for your game, ideally. So I think you can talk to experts. I think that's reasonable. Talk to peers, talk to your friends. Does this sound exciting? You can look at data. I think SteamDB or GameStats I'll talk about later. There's a lot of data. We have data in our GameDiscoverCo backend as well to see, are you moving into a fertile area? Are there too many games in the space? Are there not enough games in the space? You can try and work that out. You can A/B test. Obviously, we know that in the mobile space, people massively A/B test. I think I was reading an interview with Voodoo recently, a hyper casual company, or maybe they're hybrid casual now, I don't know. And they said they evaluate 1,500 games every year and launch 4 games. So obviously that is an extreme example, but that they are A/B testing. Well, they're testing those games against each other, and you can test your ideas. You can put them on Reddit or Imager, or talk to your friends about them before you start. And Philomena Schwab, who I think was part of this series of talks, has done a great job of that with the Wandering Village. They were showing concepts for that game before they even started a Kickstarter for it, before they'd really started coding it, I believe. And they seem to get some traction. So I'm a big fan of that. I don't think many people do that. And I understand why, especially if you don't have a large following. But I think it's an interesting thing to do. And like I said earlier, do it earlier than you think. I think if you're a lot of the way through your game, you can retrofit a lot of these ideas. But I really think it's a good idea to get an understanding of all these issues early on, because you can work on a lot of these issues before you start working on a particular game. So you could say, listen, my game doesn't need a hook. It's great. What are you talking about? And I would say, yeah, under certain specific circumstances. So for example, if your game is in an incredibly specific genre like Colony Simulator, then you're differentiated yourself without hook, because there's less of those being released in any given month and people are watching out for them. I'd also say, like if you're making a Sim City style city builder, there's not that many of those and people kind of like them. So sure, I think that's your hook. If you happen to be making a game for a subscription service, then yeah, I think that's fine. They're paying you. Maybe they're paying you the full cost of the game, so you have to worry about it less. Although you still have to worry about whether people download the game in the subscription service. There are actually, I would say, different attributes sometimes for games that are popular in subscription services versus outside. So that's additionally confusing, perhaps. But yeah, but I think that's one way to be less worried about conventional hook. And if you're the only game in town for this type of game, then maybe that's good. Like I mentioned with my work with No More Robots, Descenders has ended up doing incredibly well for No More Robots. And the main reason, frankly, was there were no other 3D mountain biking games. And that was once a genre, if people remember back in the day. There was the Activision O2 label that just did extreme sports. So it turns out that mountain biking was a genre that there were no games for, and if you wanted to go on Steam and buy a mountain biking game, you had to buy Descenders at the time. I think there's a couple more now, and so that's great. I mean, I'd argue no further hook required there, right? As long as you can find an underserved niche. Finally, and I think this one is quite important, if players already love you, then you can get away with a lot. And I think that's difficult to understand sometimes or remember when you look at certain games. So the example I sometimes give is Hades. I think Hades has done incredibly well, but obviously Supergiant, who made it, already had a very big following and people were super excited to play their game. And I'd argue that the hook on Hades is actually not that great. It's fine though. It's just like it's an ARPG with some interesting story elements. But really, they didn't have to worry about attracting players to that game. They had to worry a lot more about executing because they already had a fan base. And so I think that can help. Oh, and then yeah, just like some notes on mobile, just because I actually may be writing a newsletter about this next week from someone who's tried to get somewhere mobile nowadays. Like the mobile space is just very cutthroat, maybe even more so since I originally wrote this slide. But obviously, paid acquisition rules. You know, the premium. You know, if you're just selling a game for like $3 or $5, it's very difficult to get traction. And even free stuff like hyper casual is not as well as it used to be because they've somewhat outstayed their welcome. And this is all very difficult without a backer, because you need to get a profitable game. You need to be very cutthroat about monetization, and then you need to be profitable, and then you just need to pay to acquire users. So this whole concept of hook still very much applies if you want to, especially in hyper casual, if you want to be like, oh, what was the idea that made everyone download this game? Like, I believe there's a game where you're wearing platform heel shoes, and then your platforms get bigger and bigger, right? So that was a good example of a very strong hook for a hyper casual game. But in general, I think, you know, like mobile behaves pretty differently to PC and console, and that's why GameDiscoverCo is more of a we do PC and console, we don't really do mobile. So if you were to distill this down to an equation, which is kind of fun, it's kind of made up, but bear with me. You know, I think of a game discoverability quotient, GDQ. And so I'm saying that for me, hook is actually 55% of how you get anywhere. So from the other people will disagree with this. Other people will be like, oh, marketing is much more important. But for me, hook is super important. And so that's why I say it's all about that 55%. But there's other stuff as well. And so I just talking through those things. I think, you know, marketing beats, as I call it, you know, there's 3 or 4 inflection points through people discovering your game, and they might be announced with a gameplay trailer, or be in Next Fest, or send your game out to streamers. And so I think you just need to understand and build your discovery elements. And I think there should be generally 3 or 4 through the promotion of your game, and ideally through a 12 to 18 month period. And so I think thinking about those, whether you're doing it or you're working with a partner, is kind of important. Then nurture is just simply interacting with your fans a bunch, particularly via Discord and Steam News and blogs and your social media. And it's just important because I think sometimes, even if you have a publisher, there's a slightly weird gulf sometimes between the marketing beats, which, you know, publishers are excellent at, and then this nurturing often has to be done a little closer to the developer level, either by the developer or by a community person who's very close to the developer, because a lot of it is kind of like, what are we working on right now? Like, would you like to see this? Like, what features would you like to see in the game? And it's really meant to be very interactive, and it's really meant to nurture your fans so that they're excited about the game when it comes out. So I actually think nurture is pretty important. And actually, it's a little complicated sometimes. I've noticed, you know, like how marketing and community interact can be difficult to get right, you know, whether you're the dev or the publisher, or the dev and the publisher. So I think that's really good to think about. And my best practice is that, for example, you should be posting on Steam, on the Steam news page, at least once a month, because I think it's really important to get people to understand that you haven't abandoned the game, you're working on it. Here's some cool stuff. Finally, a launch sizzle, as I call it. You know, you need to have everything firing at the same time to release your game. So streamer outreach, incredibly important. Press outreach with embargoes, social media, Discord. And fortunes of games can really change, especially from streamers. So I think it's really important to understand that, and your trajectory can change majorly if you have the right kind of game for streamers. Here's another quote I like, and I have changed it a little bit. This is from Ben Wasser from Ooblets, which is a cute farming game. You know, it says discoverability is the discoverability is considering what's appealing, integrating that into your product, and demonstrating that appeal. I think this originally said marketing and not discoverability. So I just want to acknowledge I've changed the word marketing to discoverability, but I find marketing to be, you know, like it means many different things to many different people. And so it's sort of my preference here was to say discoverability, because I think that's way cool, more obvious. And so it really is a circular effect. And so, you know, you're considering what's appealing, you're thinking about that, you're putting it into your product, and then you're sort of showing it to people and you're saying, what do you think of that? And I think having it be much more of a circular thing rather than I'm just going to put this game out and see what happens is quite important. The second half of my talk is really about just some things that I've noticed through a few years of doing this, and I've sort of distilled them down to the 10 commandments. There's so much on this, you could probably fill 20 or 40 hours, but you've got to focus on something. And so these are particular learnings I think may not be obvious, but I think you should follow if you want to find people to find your game, if you want people to find your game. And I think these work. I mean, I'm sure we have various sizes of attendees here, from small indies to bigger devs. So I think these are quite applicable across all sizes of game dev or publisher. Firstly, this is a guy called Kevin Kelly, and he famously wrote an article back in 2008 suggesting that if you could get $100 each from your 1,000 true fans every year as a creator, you could make a great living. So it's sort of, you know, the thousand true fans idea. And we probably can't charge $100 for our game a year, but we can try and gather and interact with our fans during development, show them what we're working on and get them excited. And so I think this is important, particularly because at Steam or console launch, if you have all those people who are excited to buy the game already, then you can get a head start. You can have 50 to 100 great reviews for those who already bought it, and you can get others playing it as well. So you know, Discord's a really good way to marshal the troops and unleash them all at the same time. And you'd obviously also use your true fans for private alphas and betas, and I think that's really important as well. Like, I think as you're making these games, you know, making sure that you have someone playing it, ideally both a small amount of big fans and a larger amount of less big fans, is important, because you will effectively forestall a lot of the other problems you will otherwise get on day one on Steam or console. Because, you know, you don't want to go out there not knowing things like you have some kind of compatibility, or you forgot to do keyboard mapping, like a classic. Like if you show your game to a bunch of people before launch, they will tell you that you forgot to do keyboard mapping, and therefore you will not get a bunch of negative reviews for not doing it at launch. If you're talking about PC in particular, like, I do think there's a magic number for me, and that is Steam daily organic wishlist or follower additions. And I find that if you're doing well there, your game is going to do well. I think it's difficult to make sure your game does that, but I think that is important. And you know, and just so you know, like, ambient interest in games after you announce them can be as low as 1 or 2 wishlists a day, and as high as hundreds, occasionally low thousands of wish lists. And this is just sort of from being out there on the marketplace. And so while you can't see other people's wish lists, you can see other people's followers. And if you don't know each followers is when you follow, you know, a Steam user follows someone to get information about their news page, and it's about approximately 10 wish lists per follower is a good basic ratio to think about, although it changes quite a lot. So you can benchmark against other games. We do some of this in our GameDiscoverCo back end with our hype score. But I think it's really important because then you'll sort of understand, how are other games doing? How do I compare to those games? And the reason you don't want to look at wishlist peaks is that there's, you know, some Steam festivals and other front page features can provide, in my opinion, lower quality wish lists. They're not bad. You should still get them. They still convert better. I think actually Steam put out some data that allowed me to do some maths to say that, you know, your Steam Next Fest wish list convert, I think, 25% less well than an organic wish list or an average wish list. But that's fine, you know, like, it's still converting. You might as well do that. But I think, you know, there's some that are worse than others. So that's why I say, like, you know, if your wish list or follower chart seems to be very flat and then very up and then very flat again, like stairs, then that's a little bit more of a concern. But if your wishlist or follower chart is a bit more diagonal, then I think you're showing constant organic interest. And I think that's that can be important. So I think it's reasonable to say this. I think sometimes people are sort of obsessed with, my game needs to be very different. And I would actually argue that games that are quite similar to other games it is an advantage in the market if you pick the right games. A good example is Cities Skylines has done amazingly. And in my view, this is very clearly because people love vanilla city builders. SimCity bowed out for various reasons, and it just wasn't really a good one. And I think, you know, had other people had that insight, I feel like other people would be launching in that space. And even games like Temtem, you know, Temtem's done great. And obviously it's more than Pokemon, but we know that Pokemon is not available on non-Nintendo platforms. So I think that really helps. Stardew Valley, you can argue Harvest Moon was a great game, and you know they added Minecraft-like crafting to the game, and so I think, you know, they're games like other games. And Chris Zukowski from howtomarketagame.com did some video tracking of Steam players with their permission, and he saw a lot of this. He saw a lot of like, oh well, I like this game, and this other game looks a bit like this game. I'm interested in it. Obviously, the difficult bit is working out which game types actually have people waiting to play them and which ones are overcrowded. But I do think it's very reasonable to be okay with this. And I'm not saying you have to clone games. I'm just saying that games that are similar to other very popular games in underserved markets is absolutely a good thing for you. Organic traffic beats paid. I think that paid ads in this space can help for profile. And I do think that paid ads can return for a few high-priced games in niches. I think if you have a $40 game, then maybe you can do well, you know, by very niche advertising if it's like a niche game. But you know, from my experience with No More Robots, which you know has got a pretty big gross now in the kind of low tens of millions of dollars, that No More Robots has really not done much paid acquisition ever, and in the main, that's because I think they haven't really felt like there was good ROI on that. And obviously one issue here is that Steam and consoles are not trackable enough. You can't pixel track on them. And UTM tracking is a pretty limited help. So it's very difficult to work out whether what you're doing is useful or not. And I know people who've done large spend post-launch in kind of a quiet time, and they sort of haven't got their money back. And so one issue is you're spending during launch often, or you're spending during your first discounts, where you know there's natural spikes anyway there. So I'm not saying don't spend any money promoting your game, but what I am saying is I've seen one or two people who've spent during Steam sales, and I think they got like 25 to 50% of their money back, and compared to other sales they didn't spend in. And so I think it's just reasonable to think like, you know, is this a good use of my money? Am I targeting it enough? And actually try and do real A/B testing if you possibly can, because I think it is. I think that is important. As for what you should spend money on, I think paying streamers for disclosed advertising streams can be good if they're high profile and stream games in your demographic. That's probably one thing that I would prioritize ahead of traditional paid marketing. Also, when you do traditional paid marketing on Twitter or Facebook or others, you're competing against consumer brands who are willing to spend, in some cases, more money, I think. So that's the other issue. So I myself was editor-in-chief of Gamasutra.com, now GameDeveloper.com and Game Developer Magazine. So obviously I'm a fan of traditional media, but I do think when I track sales or wishlist spikes based on who's covered things, you know, a lot of non-TikTok social media is a small blip and not that visible. I think TikTok is an exception. But honestly, big websites mentioning games don't often lead to massive spikes in interest. Maybe with some exceptions, Rock Paper Shotgun is quite good in the PC space. But the problem is, you know, especially for us and for PR companies, it seems more tangible or prestigious to say Polygon covered this game rather than Streamer X you haven't personally heard of covered this game. So often PR folks and clients will prioritize the stuff they've heard of, but streamers time and time again show bigger boosts to me, especially YouTubers. So I still think the industry is over allocated in traditional press and under allocated in streamers. I think it's changing though. But yeah, and as to how you fix this, I think if you can connect your PR and marketing teams more directly with the real metrics, then I think that really helps, because if your PR marketing teams can see what is making a difference, they will hopefully lead into that. And certainly on the social side, People spend a lot more time than they should do on Twitter. I mean, I guess post Elon Musk, people are spending less time again on Twitter. But Twitter feels safe and you can get retweets. But for me, it is a bit of a filter bubble. I don't really see games being popular on Twitter and then being popular in quotes in real life. I mean, obviously there is crossover, but for these games to have nice GIFs that go viral on Twitter, they're not always well aligned to games that do well. And actually, in some cases, boring looking strategy games that do horribly on Twitter do very well on Steam. So I don't know. So I think the larger platforms today, like TikTok, I've written a lot in my newsletter about TikTok. TikTok is great for getting the word out about your games. TikTok is the one piece of social media I highly recommend that people spend a lot of time on. But there's also Reddit, Imager, and others. So I think this is an interesting one. A lot of people are very keen to gradually reveal information on your game, sort of keep people guessing and tease out information. I just don't think this makes sense nowadays. I think you can hold maybe one or two things back, but you really want to announce your game early with a full gameplay trailer and a full idea of the game's scope. Ideally, you want to have your Steam page and your announcements and your console pages as close to the final pitch as possible when you announce it, even if that's 18 months before it comes out. And why is that? Because people are not checking back. Like, I think it's very easy to think of your fans as a set of people who will be like, oh yeah, I'll come and check on this again. I think, if you're realistic, there's too many damn games, and there's a lot of people who are clicking around and they'll just see a game once, and that's the only time they'll see it. So in terms of how you present it, like, I think you want to have gameplay GIFs up there straight away, even if you're going to change them out for better ones later. You want to have the full hook displayed, because 95% of the people who are checking out your game are checking it out for 5 seconds once and then navigating away. And I think the more we can be realistic about that and say, well, that's the time that you have to hook people, the better, versus, well, I'll let them watch this 2-minute trailer and at the end they'll be excited. I think realistically most people don't hang out that long, and so I think if you only have partial information or teases and you're not showing everything, then you're not putting your best foot forward. I know that some big franchises can do this, and that's why it's confusing. Like, if you're Halo or Resident Evil, you can totally get away with this. There's a big fan base who are waiting, and they will wait through teasers, but I don't think it's helpful for most games. Post-release marketing tool, I think you probably all know this and it's not news to you, but like, discounts, kind of a big deal, and you should be very methodical about them. I think one thing that is interesting is, who in your company is in charge of post-release discounts? Do they spend a good time on it? Are they really looking at it? And do they have a methodical way of doing it? That's sort of one of my main takeaways, because I think if you are methodical, and publishers like Team 17, I think are pretty methodical and sort of know what they're doing here, then you are going to have a very specific, discount on Steam 12 times a year, and you're going to, every 3 or 4 sales, you're going to step down by another 5 to 10%. And I think it's really good to be very methodical about that, because that is honestly the most money I see people leaving on the table, where especially maybe the launch hasn't gone as well as you hope, so you're just kind of like, and then you sort of forget about it. But no, I mean, there's additional money you can get there, and you should really deal with very methodically. And I think, services like IndieBI, one of the things that they're pretty good at is reminding people to discount correctly and showing you how much money you lose if you don't discount correctly. But again, not necessarily a large percentage off, but this is really just a question of, you start off at 20%, do 3 sales at 20%, then go to 25, then 30, then 40, etc., etc. Back to streamers. I think I've already played them up, and what I'd say here is, I think you need to spend serious time, or get someone to spend serious time finding streamers who are right for your game, based on the other things you stream. You can't just rely on sites like Woovit or Keymailer. I think those sites are maybe good for some additional interest, but they don't get a lot of the most discerning YouTubers or Twitch folks on them. So I think lots of manual research needed, and not just English language. I think this is important. I mean, like, maybe you do need to work with an agency who has local local knowledge there. But certainly the folks at No More Robots, when they launched Yes Grace, there were German language streamers with 500,000 YouTube subs, and they gave massive boosts to the game. But they weren't necessarily anyone that, you know, I mean, if there's German folks on the call, they would have heard of them. But you know, in different, we don't know. Certainly, you know, I don't know German language streamers. So I think you really want to be sending people keys, and you want to have a lot of knowledge there, because I think it can make a difference. And I don't think you need very special skills to do this. I think you need good old-fashioned legwork, but it really is, you know, the amount of people you could target here is pretty gigantic. And I think understanding this and understanding what kind of games they will play is really important, you know, and yeah, and I just think it's very underutilized. Demos, I recently had a column in my newsletter about this, but you know, there's been a big resurgence in game demos, but I don't think everyone is a bit confused about whether they work or not. And my comment is that demos, honestly, are often an early predictor of how well your game is going to do. And by which I say, your demo or Steam Prologue will do great if your game is going to do great, and you will pick up additional interest. But you know, it's not necessarily, oh, I did this demo and now my game is a smash. There's a few examples I can think of which you know, like Loop Hero, where I do think their you know, their pitch, people got way more excited about that game because of the demo, and that does happen occasionally, but most of the time I think it's really like a reflection of how your game is going to do, and that's fine, and I think you should do it. You know, but I also think you should do it more than once, because one issue nowadays, if you're just like, well, we're going to put a demo in Next Fest and then we'll release it, like Next Fest is great, it's, you know, for a lot, but it has hundreds of demos in it, and it got very busy, and people are really trying to pre-game the system now by, you know, releasing their demo to streamers early so they can be in the charts when Next Fest starts, and all kinds of pretty complicated stuff. So I definitely recommend now having your demo available to streamers, and ideally, you know, as your members of the public at a different time in addition to Next Fest. And you can maybe do a prologue, but I'm kind of neutral on prologues nowadays, which are standalone Steam apps that are really your demo and are a bit of a hack. But I do think that yeah, having multiple bites of the cherry here is kind of important, because every time you try this, different streamers might pick up your game. So I think having at least a couple of those opportunities is important. And also think about how you structure your demo and whether your game is even right for a demo. There are some types of games that are not that well suited to demos. Finally, I think thinking about player interest and what player management issue you have is important. And I sort of talk about hype a lot. And obviously, most of the time you have a hype problem, which is to say not enough people know about your game, and you need to make sure more people know about it, which is great. But sometimes as you get closer to release, and if you've done a really good job, you run into a different problem. It's an expectation management problem, and that expectation management problem can really bite you. And really the problem is this: is the game that you're releasing the same one that people think they are excited about? And this is incredibly important, and I don't think enough people pay attention to this. Maybe it's really, you know, like, what do people think this game is, and what is it? And if you get this wrong, it can be really bad. And actually, a good example recently, not picking on them, is Storyteller, which was Daniel Ben-McGee and Anna Perna released it, and it's done good. It's done good. I think it's going to sell a couple of 100,000 copies, but they had a lot of trouble with this at launch. And the problem was the game is a fairly short linear title, but it's all about lots of different possibilities. And so, in my opinion, the description of the game actually made it sound more expansive than it actually is. And so what happened is people got in really excited. They played it. It finished after like 2 hours. It's $15. I think that was okay. But that was just not people's expectation. And then everyone came and complained and got mad at the dev, especially because I guess there was a small bit of a previous demo that wasn't in the final game. So they were like, ah. But I thought that was a really valuable lesson, because I do not think that Daniel and Annapurna set expectations correctly for that game, and there was interest in it. So I think you just need to keep checking back on that. And I would have suggested that they said it was short and linear, even if that's cost you a few sales, because then I think you won't have as many issues with people getting confused and down rating you. Then just a couple of, you may know these, but a couple of information on Steam, on discovery sources. You know, SteamDB, it was just gigantic and very complicated. It has a whole bunch of great data for free. And I think if you look at it has CCUs, it has owner estimates, and obviously follower trending, I think, is particularly helpful. So I often look at follower trending on SteamDB. The site Games Stats, which is less well known, it has some enhanced features that are subscriber only, but I quite like it for Steam tag browsing. And obviously, you know, there's 408 Steam tags, and it's really good. And we will be building actually some of this into our GameDiscoverCo backend pretty soon as well. But you can easily see average and median revenue for certain tags and scroll around. So I think it's pretty useful. I'd also recommend, by the way, going to Steam itself and sorting by latest release in that tag to get a good idea about what's going on. I think sometimes if you want to make a game, you're kind of like, well, it must be doing great, but like go look at recent Steam releases in that tag and sort of see how stuff's doing. Some tags are doing way better than others. And then GameDiscoverCo, you folks may know we have this newsletter, newsletter.gamediscover.co, and we have a paid element where you can pay like $15 a month and get access to our hype charts. And what we do is we rank all 10,000 unreleased Steam games in terms of hype points, which we sort of made up, but a lot of it is related to Steam followers, and chatter is how many forum posts certain Steam games have. So we sort of have a bunch of information there, and I think understanding follower numbers and your Steam wishlist ranking. Steam has a ranking for top unreleased wishlisted games. I think that's really important to understand as well, because you start to understand more like how you're doing contextually. Finally, like I realized that there's a lot of stuff I haven't covered here that I could cover. So I'm actually, so I just like ended up, since we have a little bit more time, I ended up like riffing a few of these, and I'm going to do like 30 seconds on each of these because I think they're actually interesting. Firstly, the state of Nintendo Switch. Switch, very busy market. I think it's difficult to scale on Switch nowadays. I think it's possible to get your game to sell 5,000 or 10,000 units. I think it's actually quite difficult on Switch nowadays to sell 50 to 100,000 units or more. There are some games that are doing it. I think, you know, some of these tidy games like Unpacking and A Little to the Left have done very well recently, and I think have sold hundreds of thousands. But definitely with like 25 to 30 games a week coming out on Switch, it's easy to get relegated to the, oh, I sold a couple of thousand copies area. And obviously discovery is very poor on Switch due to the eShop being pretty basic. So you have to rely on large discounts to get into the eShop charts sometimes, which obviously reduces your revenue. So not so good. Is it a good idea to launch multi-platform? It can be, but I'm actually more of a fan of PC first nowadays, and then going multi-platform if it makes sense, maybe at a 1.0 release. Because I think, you know, like Xbox, unless you're on Game Pass, doesn't sell that well. I think for certain types of games, PlayStation sells very well. And for a few types of games, Switch sells well. But it can be pretty expensive to port. And in particular, if you need to get your game perfect to get through console cert before you launch, you need to spend a lot of time on QA. And I actually think it might be a better idea to launch on PC with a pretty good version and knock out all the QA issues, and then it'll be so much easier and so much more organic to get through console lot check later. And also, I do feel like people I know who are very rigid about launching multi-platform, sometimes it means you lock down the game like 6 months before release, and I think it's not good for the game sometimes. I think you know, it needs to be a bit more organic than that. So I do think you need to think very carefully about multi-platform. Unless it's a big enough game, obviously. Why would you launch into early access versus 1.0? I think nowadays, I've written a column or two on this. Early access is a bit of a state of mind. It's not clear to me that people judge early access games that differently to 1.0 games. I think if you have a really good game and it has not quite enough content, then you'll get away with it more in early access. But a lot of the time, early access is not like, oh, I've got a basic beta of my game, I can shove it up there. Your game needs to be pretty finished to put it out in early access. Is it a good idea to have a publisher? Yeah, it can be, yeah. I mean, I've advised people both to get publishers and to not get publishers. I think you need a publisher if you need the money to finish a game. That's non-negotiable. If you can't, if you haven't got the money to finish your game, you're going to have to get a publisher or a funder. I think publishers are very good at certain things. I think publishers are really good at platform relations. So if you want to get a Game Pass deal, maybe your publisher is signing lots of Game Pass deals at the same time with Xbox, and you wouldn't get that deal otherwise. I think that's great. I think publishers are good at things like helping you with localization and QA. And actually, I like publishers who get appropriately involved in games and help you guide them. So sort of like help you make the game better. I think that's where publishers really shine. I think, the downside of publishers can be, obviously, they take a lot of your post-recoup money, and sometimes they spend money on stuff that makes sense to them, but might not make sense to you. And I guess I might be picking on paid marketing there, where I think, some publishers are quite heavy on the paid marketing. And my concern there is, as a dev, maybe it wastes your money because they're not getting full ROI on it anyway. But feel free to argue with me about that in the written Q&A. What genres of games should you target? I talk about this quite a lot. I think on PC, there are clearly certain types of games that do better. And they're often kind of deep strategy crafting games. Whether you should really target those games, I don't know. But you can find lists of genres that are performing better. But they are very PC-centric games, and it sort of stops you from making any money on other platforms. So, it's ultimately up to you. But I think you should think pretty carefully about the genre you're going into and whether it's overcrowded or appropriately crowded. What's so difficult about launching multiplayer? I actually had, if you read my newsletter yesterday, this is coincidental because I put this bullet point down a while ago. I had exactly a conversation on this, which is sort of the cold start problem. And the problem with multiplayer is, if it's not co-op, you're going to need minimum CCU to get off the ground and stay off the ground. And that can be really difficult because people are fickle and they may not hang out in your game. So it is pretty difficult, and that's why I prefer co-op nowadays. I think co-op scales better than PvP multiplayer. Finally, is VR a good market to enter nowadays? Yes and no. I think clearly Quest is the market that makes sense, but I think Quest is slowing down a little bit, and I think there's some evergreen titles that are doing very well. And I think it's quite expensive to make VR games sometimes because they're complicated 3D games. So I think if you can get backing from Meta, and if Meta's going to co-fund your game, then I think VR can still make sense. And they do co-fund a lot of games. But otherwise, it can be tricky. It is at least way less crowded than PC. And even I think Switch maybe. So that's the good bit. And that's basically my talk. So we can go to Q&A if you want.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much, Simon. Let's start with Alexander, who has a couple of questions. The first one relates to the beginning of the presentation when you were talking about hooks and how to what the definition of a hook for a game. So the question of Alexander is it sometimes worth trying to find several hooks for a game? For instance, and also use one that suits a given platform better. For instance, if putting focus on a specific hook on Steam and another hook on Twitter, or should you always focus on the same idea for selling your game?
I think you should always focus on the same idea, because I think there's generally only one idea that really works, and I think it's difficult to find different angles. And also I think if you switch up your angles between different platforms, it may be difficult to like, people may move between the platforms, then they'll be like, well, this game wasn't like it was explained to me on Steam. So I'd recommend finding one clear hook, and then just sort of using that one line or that angle everywhere. But you can do different things on different platforms. Like, for example, TikTok. There's plenty of stuff you can do on TikTok that's kind of like catchy and interesting that isn't just about the hook of your game. So I'm not saying you have to repeat the same idea everywhere, but I think, the general idea about why people might like your game should be pretty universal, I think.
And it kind of relates to the question of Peter. Is it better to put your material early on? So when a material is a concept art, GIFs, trailers, videos, and so on, is it better to put them early on, or to wait for to sign with the publisher and for your publisher to define your marketing strategy and when to share them to the world? Peter is worried about wasting valuable material that you can present as new only once in the lifetime of your game.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because it depends if you sign with a publisher or not, right? Because the publisher might have the publisher might be like, oh, why did you do that? I wanted to do that. So it really depends what your publisher wants to do. I think my comment, and also I didn't really talk about this, but like sometimes there's an advantage about not announcing your game before you sign with a publisher, because then the effect of announcing your game is unknown. So this is an interesting thing whereby if you do need a publisher, you know, there's an argument to be made that you shouldn't announce your game before you find a publisher, because maybe if you announce your game and no one cares, then your publisher is going to take that into account when they evaluate your game. So there's kind of an interesting kind of cat and mouse issue there. So I think that relates to it. But what I'd say is the minimum you need to announce your game is sort of like some GIFs and a gameplay trailer, I would say. And so if you want to do that and then not show people anything else, I think that's fine. And then as you go through development, you can do Steam news posts with more information or concept art. And so that's how I would approach it. But yeah.
And speaking of publishers, Alexander asks, are area publishers worth it? Like specific publishers to promote and distribute your game in China or Japan or other part of the world that are a little bit different from the Western world?
Interestingly, historically, I have generally said not, but I've been convinced recently by at least one person that Chinese publishers can be useful, because, you know, China is a really big market, and obviously on Steam you can publish grey market in China. So at the very least, you should always have a Chinese translation for your game. But I have seen at least one example of a game that was not popular until a Chinese publisher picked it up in China. So you know, so I think I would not recommend a Japanese publisher personally, but I think in a few cases Chinese publishers can help. But honestly, you can put out a game Chinese language from anywhere and just sort of see how it does. So I think for most types of games, it's perfectly acceptable to do that.
All right. Maybe a question from Julien. So Julian notes that these commandments apply to premium games mostly. Well, not mostly, but all of them apply to premium games. What commandments would you say change for a game as a service? Would you insert new ones, take off some?
Yeah, I mean, games, obviously there can be different types of games as a service. There can be premium ones, and there can be free ones, and there can be anywhere in between. Yeah, I think the other stuff is true with games as a service, and it changes up your rules a little bit, but some stuff still applies. Like I still think, you know, like co-op is easier to deal with in games as co-op and single player. I think just scale up and down better than true multiplayer. And a lot of games, I will say, a lot of premium games, like my definition of games as a service is anyone who continuously updates their game. So for me, a lot of games that just are $20 and never charge any extra money, I call those games as a service, because you know, they're still updating the game continuously for players. So yeah, so it sort of depends on the definition, but I would say some things you need to think about with games as a service is definitely like, what is your roadmap and what are you charging for it? Like, because you're going to have free updates and paid DLC probably, and so there's a lot of details around that which I think are really, really good to think about.
Right. Coming back to the notion of hook, Celine notes that it's you mentioned an interesting point when you say that you know, players sometimes enjoy a game and want to play more of that specific genre, or games similar to it. The question is, when is it okay to reference similar successful games, and when does it or can it backfire?
That's a good question. Like I believe, for example, Nintendo Switch, I think someone told me that the Nintendo Switch gets difficult about you referencing other games in the page. They actually maybe don't let you sometimes. So in some cases, I think you're not allowed to reference other games. And I do think it can be a little bit cheesy to reference other games in your formal marketing. So I would not really recommend doing that. You know, like for City Skylines, like their marketing was not. It's like SimCity, like that's too cheesy. But I think what you want to do is you want to try and make players and streamers put that in their headlines. And editors, like so I think if you can sort of, you know, like No More Robots has a game called Spirit T, and some of the headlines for that game were like, oh, it's like Stardew Valley meets Spirited Away. And I'm like, and that's really good. And you want to get someone to say that, but you probably, I don't know if you can necessarily like put that out in your formal mark. You just want to kind of try and make people do it. I think that's sort of my argument.
Okay. And a personal question on that on the topic. You did say that you may want to go for a genre that players are eager for, and when there is still room left in the market space for that, but you do want to avoid the genres that are overcrowded. What tools do you use, and how can you analyze that genre is overcrowded, or that players are waiting to play other similar games?
Yeah, that is quite difficult. And I find, because, you know, I work with a few publishers, and often I'm sort of giving my opinions on whether they should sign games or not. And I find a lot of it is pretty subjective. Like, I'm definitely like, well, I've seen a whole bunch of stuff and I think this game is similar to this game, but I don't think I can necessarily do it with a tool. One thing you can do, you know, SteamDB has this, but certainly, you know, not as a plug. My GameDiscoverCo back end for unreleased games, you can just look at all unreleased games and you can sort them by Steam tag. So if you're like, I want to make a city builder, how many other people are currently making city builders and how popular are they? You can sort of see that list. And if you wanted to, I think we should do this at some point. You could sort of map a curve of how much hype they have and then map it against other tags. The only problem with that is there's like 20 tags for each Steam game. Some of these tags are rated a little bit higher than others. I think we're going to try and introduce a way so you can sort by tags that are rated higher. But sometimes tags for Steam games are not completely representative of the game they are, because it might be tag number 20, and like and so it's not that relevant. But I think, yeah, looking at Steam tags for both released and unreleased games, I think is the best way you can sort of try to eyeball this type of stuff, and particularly look at, and the other thing I said, I guess, was look at recent releases. Go to a tag page on Steam, look at recent releases, scroll back a really long way and try and work out, like, are there any games that have sold well and like why. I think that's good as well.
Right. A couple of questions from Martin on GameHook, and then we have a few questions on streamers. First, GameHook. So, is there a list of written game hooks somewhere? Someone that has created that, and do you have like a specific method that you can advise on how to define and write a game hook?
No, I mean, in terms of game hooks, the main thing I think about is, you know, the Steam capsule description, you know, the Steam description that appears just underneath the main icon. I think, you know, that often that they're a little bit longer than maybe what I would call a hook, but often those are what I would call a hook. So I think if you go and look at some bigger publishers, well, actually, really big publishers are bad because their game is already popular and they write bad text there. But if you look at small or medium, you know, like your Devolvers or your Team 17s or your Raw Furies, you know, they've probably put some time into, or Focus. You know, I think that they spent some time in working out hopefully what their game hook is, and it should be in that. It should be in that text area, and if it's not, then it just means that they've made their description a bit floatier. But I definitely think being quite specific in that area is good. Like, what are you going to get? And then in terms of how you do that, I do think, yeah, it's looking at other games that have done it well, and for me, it's always, I think, there's sort of two things here. There's like the hook, like why do people really want to play it? And then there's like, have you explained the game properly to people? Those things are slightly different, but interrelate to each other. And in both cases, I think, you need to think about, yeah, like what is a catchy kind of gameplay first way I can describe this game? You know, and I guess, you know, an example, Spirity, you know, it's kind of like a wholesome slice of life simulator where you have to look after a bathhouse that's full of ghosts. You know, like that sounds like fun, like bathhouse full of ghosts. I don't know. So yeah, why that sounds fun, I don't know. So it can be pretty subjective, I guess. So, but yeah, I think look at lots of other game Steam capsule descriptions is my main comment.
All right. Thanks for the answer. So, to a couple of questions on the topic of streamers. First, good advices on good tools or ways to find streamers that are relevant, especially when they speak different languages. So, do you have any tools to advise? Do you advise to go through agencies?
Yeah, it can be a little bit difficult, to your point. I mean, there is like, and I don't know, since I don't directly work in this area, I don't know all agencies. One comment I'll have is there's a company called ICO Partners, run by Thomas Bidot, I know that they specifically, interestingly, are structured so they sort of have regional kind of PR who I think also know streamers. So I think it's really good if you can find agencies that sort of, and that might be ICO's particular hook. They're sort of pan-European, so you don't have to find a different person in France, Germany, or etc. So I think that's one thing you can do. You can also just, I feel like, you don't even necessarily need to know the language, I don't think, as long as you're just looking up games. Because if there's particular games that are similar to your game and you look it up, and there's very clearly a German language streamer who's been playing it because you can see the name in the game description, then you can email that German language streamer in English and give them a copy of the key and it would be okay. I think that's sort of a good starting point, because to your point, you probably don't want to have, you know, a bunch of people who know different languages all on staff just for this. But so I think the basic version is email everyone keys even if you don't understand their language, and a better version is try to find companies that have relationships with some of these bigger regional streamers, and also like not just European. Like I know in South America, there's big streamers in South America as well who, again, you probably want to find ways to get in contact with. So yeah.
Yeah, the question from Peter was kind of the same. Some specific approaches or tools for finding YouTuber influencers. For Twitch, you have Solid Gnome that is pretty known.
Yeah, I was going to mention it. Yeah. If people don't know, Sully Gnome, SULLYGNOME, Sully Gnome is pretty good. You can look up particular games and see which particular streamers have played them. But YouTube is messy, like because YouTube doesn't allow extensive use of its API, so you have to just look on YouTube a lot of the time.
Yeah. I had a follow-up question on that, which is, do you have any data points about views on various platforms to wishlist conversion?
Oh, you mean like store views?
Not sure, but like if my game is played by someone on Twitch that does 10,000 views, how does that convert in terms of wishlist?
No, I don't really. I mean, it's highly variable based on the audience. Like, and this is something I didn't talk about. Like, there were some streamers who had, like maybe 2 million people will watch a YouTube video about your game. But really, that particular YouTuber, people care about the YouTuber. They don't care about the game. And as a result, not that many people buy the game. So there's a very different. And whereas there's some specialized YouTubers, and I think if you Google for GameDiscoverCo and kind of like top YouTubers or indie YouTubers, I did a little list fairly recently that was just some basic ones, but you've got your Splatter Cats, your Northern Lions, and kind of there's various streamers who actually are much more like people, at least who play PC games, really check these people out, and so you'll get a much better wishlist conversion with your Splatter Cat than you will a big variety personality-led streamer playing your game, maybe. Although it can vary. I do some work with Merge, and their game Bramble that just came out got picked up by Jacksepticeye, and Jacksepticeye is a massive YouTuber, and he doesn't play many games nowadays. And I think they did. My impression is like that they did pretty good out of him playing it, even though he's not like a big games YouTuber. But that was more like a horror game, and I guess people often want to play horror games if they see streamers playing it. So yeah.
It works. We're out of question. I did have last one personally that kind of related. You did mention that organic traffic is better than paid traffic. Do you have any hacks to give for generating or boosting organic traffic that works especially well these days?
Yeah, it's rough because organic traffic is literally, do people like the idea of your game? So it's kind of like the answer is generally yes or no. But I have noticed, like, one thing is, like, organic traffic I think sometimes does come from YouTube long term. So one comment I would have is, like, I do think you can increase your organic traffic if you allow streamers or YouTubers to get a version of your game quite early. And I think that is sometimes against what people want to do, but I actually am starting to think it's a good idea. So, for example, if like you have an alpha of the game that's still pretty fun to play, and it's like a year before release, and you can persuade YouTubers to play it just for an hour, I think the good thing about that is it just keeps showing, people just keep finding it on YouTube, and then they click across and maybe wishlist your game. So I would say the only way I know to increase your organic wishlist rate, and it's kind of an organic wishlist rate, is actually to allow streamers to play your game pretty early. And I think that helps, and or maybe be in a next fest early as well, because that might help as well. But other than that, it really just is like, like, it's how much people like your game. And I think obviously in the hyper casual space on mobile, like I was saying with Voodoo, they obviously do this, and they do this for like 1,500 games, and then they just pick the 4 that have the best results, and we can't do that because well, at least it's much more difficult to do that for PC and console. So, but I do think you should take hints from your organic wishlist rate, and sometimes I do think, like, I've got at least one client who recently launched, paid for a prototype of a game. They launched a Steam page for it. They discovered it didn't have great organic wish lists, and now they are not going to do it. So I mean, I actually do think that is a legitimate approach. It's just not many people do it on PC and console nowadays. But I think it is worth thinking about.
Is your client a publisher or an indie developer?
My client is a smallish publisher. So basically, they saw a developer with an idea they liked. They went to the developer and said, "Can we pay you to do a prototype so we can see what Steam thinks of it?" They put it on Steam, and then they had a video and like a full page, and then they monitored the results. Okay. So I think that's quite unconventional. But sort of like Playway, famously, like Playway, the Polish publisher, sort of does this, because Playway launches a whole bunch of pages for games with target gameplay trailers, and I think they do often then leave some of the pages dormant and then just work on the games that have the most interest. So some people do this, but it's not very conventional.
I believe they do that. All right, I guess we're out of questions, so that concludes this masterclass. A lot of good tips. So thanks a lot for that, Simon, and thank again everybody for coming. Well, I'll see some of you next week.
Cool. Okay, thanks everyone.
All right, bye.
Is a smallish publisher. So basically, they saw a developer with an idea they liked. They went to the developer and said, "Can we pay you to do a prototype so we can see what Steam thinks of it?" They put it on Steam, and then they had a video and like a full page, and then they monitored the results. Okay. So I think that's quite unconventional. But sort of like Playway, famously, like Playway, the Polish publisher, sort of does this, because Playway launches a whole bunch of pages for games with target gameplay trailers, and I think they do often then leave some of the pages dormant and then just work on the games that have the most interest. So some people do this, but it's not very conventional.
I believe they do that. All right, I guess we're out of questions, so that concludes this masterclass. A lot of good tips. So thanks a lot for that, Simon, and thank again everybody for coming. Well, I'll see some of you next week.
Cool. Okay, thanks everyone.
All right, bye.